Hello, welcome once again. This intro video is for Chapter 23 of the Foner textbook, The United States in the Cold War. Now, as we saw in the last chapter, the United States was engaged in a massive conflict, one that really, is a true world war. There's almost no place in the world that something wasn't fought over, or these countries didn't fight against each other in. The only place really what didn't see any combat was Antarctica. So this massive conflict really has made some changes in the world, not just militarily, but just socially and logistically. Everything has really changed after this. The powers that used to be running the world, these European powers like Britain and France and Germany, are now bankrupt and broken countries. They're going to have a long time to repair themselves. It really leaves two countries in some kind of shape here after the end of the war: the United States and the Soviet Union, allies that had worked together to defeat their enemies. And this war is going to have an effect on both of these countries. Both of them are going to remember that it was a very aggressive country, Germany under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, that had really brought this on, because nobody had stood up to him, because nobody had tried to limit his aggression. He was left unchecked. He was able to kind of keep pushing his personal will, his national agenda onto other countries. His hyper-aggression helped launch the Second World War. And another thing that both countries realized was that now war was a much more terrible thing than it had ever been before. With the use of atomic weapons in Japan, all sides understood that war now was an even more dangerous enterprise than it had been before. That really these weapons could destroy whole societies if there were enough of them. So the world seemed to be a much scarier place, even after defeating, such aggressive countries like Germany and Japan during World War II. And that was a big challenge. How is this world going to be reorganized, rebuilt, kind of reordered? And for the Americans, this came down to our vice president, Harry Truman, who took over from FDR when FDR died in April of 1944. And Truman's going to be the president that's going to have to figure out how the United States is going to deal with this situation. What is our relationship with the Russians going to be going forward? How are we going to fix all the problems that the world has now after this severe conflict where so many people have died? 100 million people really are killed or maimed by this war. So this really soft-spoken politician from Missouri, a man that had failed at almost everything he did in his personal life as far as business and that sort of thing goes, somebody that had seen war firsthand as a United States Army personnel, an artillery captain in World War I, as somebody that was actually supported by a corrupt political machine in Kansas City, when he himself was a very popular and very scrupulously honest politician. So he was kind of filled with a lot of dichotomies, really. He was a failed businessman that was a successful politician. He was a great dad by all accounts, a very good man, but he was supported by a corrupt political machine. So kind of interesting that he ended up being FDR's vice presidential pick in 1944. But FDR had never told anybody that he was in such bad health, and Truman was simply on the ticket just to help gain Southern voters, to try and get the Democratic Party solid South to vote for them one more time. And he's the man that ends up having to deal with this really momentous decisions that have to be made here at the end of the Second World War. And he had a kind of an interesting personal philosophy. He really did take these things personally. He understood that as President of the United States, he had to make these decisions, and he wasn't afraid to make them. He had a very famous saying that he said the buck stops here, that he was the ultimate person in charge, and he would be taking care of these problems. So it was kind of an interesting man to be on the scene when all of these things happened in 1944 and 1945. So this soft-spoken Midwestern politician has a lot on his plate when he takes over for the president in 1944. He has to meet with the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, and work out kind of the ends to the World War II, get the Soviets to work along with the United States, continue to be our allies until our enemies are defeated. And he does. He gets the Russians to help us defeat Germany, and then he gets their assistance in defeating Japan as well. Unfortunately, that cooperation ends almost as quickly as the war does. Very quickly, once Japan is defeated, the Russians stop being our friends and being more on their own, kind of doing the things that they want to do that affect their national interests. As Soviet armies advance in places like northern China, where Japanese troops had been, and all throughout Eastern Europe, where German troops have been, they don't leave. They stay and occupy, sometimes looting whole sections of Germany and Austria and taking those goods back to the Soviet Union, which had been devastated by those countries, by German and Austrian troops and others. So the Russians are really bent on revenge in some cases, and they're also bent on control. They want to make sure that now that they've been invaded twice by Germany in the past 30 or 40 years, that they don't see a third one. That they want to make sure that they have some kind of buffer zone between them and the rest of Europe. And they go about systematically making sure that Eastern European countries, even in the Baltic all the way down into the Balkans, make sure that these countries understand that the Soviet Union is really the one in charge, that they're going to be calling the shots, at least on a strategic level, maybe not completely internally, but they're going to pick the leaders for these countries. They're going to be the ones that make sure that these countries stay loyal to them and don't allow any outside influences that can undermine Russia's security. So the United States and the Soviet Union no longer see eye to eye. During the war, Truman and Stalin had worked out deals that would say these countries would get to choose their own paths, that they get to choose their own leaders, that they wouldn't be influenced by either the United States or the Soviet Union. But that relationship, that understanding seems to be quickly breaking down here in the immediate post-war world. Winston Churchill, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, is going to come to the United States in the late 1940s and start telling Americans, it looks like there's an iron curtain here in Europe, that the Russians have just kind of descended down on these countries and taken control of them, not allowing them their own choices, not allowing their own freedoms. And this is an especially scary moment because the Russians have the largest army in the world. It was their military that had largely defeated Nazi Germany. And with such a large army, there was really nobody that could contest this. The only way the United States could was with its also impressive military, but also the fact that it had nuclear weapons and nobody else did. So it seemed a very kind of a tumultuous period, that the world was very unstable all of a sudden, especially with the Soviets seemed to be more interested in getting countries on their side, to making sure that they controlled more and more territory. And this became especially troubling when in late 1945, 1946, Russian agents seemed to be popping up all over Europe, funneling money and weapons to different dissident groups, especially communist groups in Western and Southern Europe, places like Greece and Italy and even in France sometimes, that it seemed like they were bent on really kind of taking over Europe. So once again, the United States sees a very aggressive country out there, one that's bent on doing its own things, one that seems to be kind of ignoring the relationships that have been built up. And this becomes even worse when in 1946, Stalin begins making public announcements or addresses to the Russian people, telling them that he can't demobilize it. He needs to keep this large Soviet military buildup that's happened for the World War II going after the war is over, because he's afraid that war with the West is inevitable, that at some point the United States and the Soviet Union are going to go to war with each other. So the Truman administration has to come up with a response. They have to decide, are they going to allow Russia to act unilaterally, do whatever it wants? And they feel that that's unacceptable. They've seen what happens when you leave an aggressive nation to itself, to allow it to do whatever it wants. It just gets more aggressive. So they have to come up with some kind of response to this. And an American diplomat in the Soviet Union, in Moscow, by the name of George Kennan, comes up with an idea. Says that this should be the U.S. policy going forward, that we can deal with the Russians, that they're not as crazy as Hitler was, that they will respond to force, they understand kind of realpolitik, as the Germans would say. So this American diplomat sends out a very long communique to the Truman administration and kind of lays out what he thinks needs to be done here. And because he's been a diplomat so long in the Soviet Union, his voice carries a lot of weight. The Truman administration looks at this communication, this long telegram as it's called, and decides that at its core, his policy is very strong, has a lot of good ideas, and it makes a lot of sense. And what Kennan argued the Truman administration needed to do was understand that the Soviets are going to be aggressive. They are going to push for more territory, a buffer zone around their country. That's just kind of the way Russians were, that these Soviets weren't really much different than the Russians had been. He also said that the United States needs to stop that expansion because it won't stop until Russians are faced with force, with a threat of violence. That's the only thing that will get them to turn around, to turn back. So he said the U.S. is going to have to step in and start supporting any nations along the Soviet borders to make sure that they don't fall under Soviet influence. He said the best thing that the United States could do is get a group of countries around Russia that were loyal to the United States, that weren't weak, weren't susceptible to Russian influences, that couldn't be bullied by the Russians, and that would help contain communism, keep it from spreading, keep the Russian influence from spreading. And once you kind of kept them contained, then we could see if their system even worked, because as long as they're expanding, their system appears to work. But Kennan argued that we don't even know if communism works. It could fall apart at any time. Also, we don't know if they know how to transfer leadership successfully. There'd only been two Russian leaders, Lenin and then Stalin. And in between those leaders, they had a very, very dangerous time in Russia where there was a lot of internal fighting in the Communist Party. There were purges where tens of thousands of people were killed and executed. So Kennan argued this could all fall apart the minute Stalin dies. We don't know. The only thing we can do is try and protect people, protect the world from them. Just try to hem them in, keep them contained in a corner. So the Truman administration takes this plan and says, it makes sense. It seems like the best way to go. It seems like a way to deal with this. We know the alternative of doing nothing, what happens then. You get an aggressive nation like Germany. So now the Truman administration tries to do the opposite, to meet force with force, to meet aggression with aggression, to try and stand up to the Russians. And they're going to start devising plans. And one of the first ones is a thing called the Marshall Plan, putting this idea of containment into action. The Secretary of State for the Truman administration, George Marshall is kind of given the task of implementing some of this plan that Kennan comes up with, this containment policy. And Marshall argued that that's really where the United States needs to start, is in Europe. That's the most crucial place in the world for the United States. It's kind of where the backbone of our economic engine goes. It's where we sell a lot of our stuff. There are partners. Countries like France and Great Britain are important to the United States. We need friends. So Marshall argued that that's where we need to start. We need to help these countries recover. They're devastated by World War II. They've lost a lot of people. Their economies are in shambles. For the most part, their infrastructure is in shambles as well. Places like Germany are completely devastated and have to be rebuilt from the ground up almost. And they can't do it on their own. And because they're in such bad shape, because people are starving, because there is no economy, it makes them very susceptible to Russian intrigue, to Russian aggression. It makes it impossible for them to really stand up against the Russians. So Marshall said that's where we need to start. Let's pour in money into Europe. Let's fix Europe, help it rebuild and recover. And because of that, the Europeans will stay friendly to us, and they'll help us resist the Russian advances. So the United States government's going to spend more than $13 billion aiding these European countries. And they're going to open it up to everyone. The United States government's going to say to any European country, even Russia itself, the Soviet Union's going to be offered loans or just giveaways from the United States government to help repair the damage. Of course, the Russians are going to say no, because to take that money would imply weakness, that they somehow needed help from the United States, who's looking more and more like their enemy, or at least their rival. So they say no, and they make sure that all these countries that they're starting to gain control of say no as well. But of course, a lot of Western European countries do take the United States up on their offer. And they work with the United States to kind of rebuild their countries, to rebuild their economies. And it's a beneficial arrangement for both sides. Europeans get to get back on their feet. The United States gains allies and friends in the world. And all of them can work together to make sure that Soviet influences are curtailed. But this Marshall Plan is only part of this policy. Another important aspect of it is when President Truman goes before Congress in 1947 and says, even as we're helping rebuild Europe, we have to do more. That it's not just a simple fact of that we need to help Great Britain and France and Germany rebuild their economies, that we need to help countries defend themselves. And he gave two very important examples. He said that two European countries, Greece and Turkey, are both in a lot of trouble. Both countries are devastated by World War II. Both countries are politically unstable right now, and both are seeing a lot of aggression from agents working on behalf of the Soviet Union. Greece has a large number of communists trying to take over its government. Turkey is actually under direct pressure by the Soviet Union to open its territory so that the Soviet military can use Turkey for bases. Truman said that that's unacceptable. We can't allow the Soviet Union to start rolling over parts of Europe, because if it starts, it'll never stop. So he goes before Congress and says that we need to aid these countries. That any country, not just Greece and Turkey, but any country that's threatened by a totalitarian government, an aggressive nation like the Soviet Union, needs to be defended. And the only country in the world right now that can do that can help these countries out, is the United States. So Truman goes before Congress, and he gets the U.S. to commit itself to defending any country, anywhere, for any length of time that is threatened by an aggressive nation, that there are no limits to U.S. aid anymore. So the United States has completely turned itself around. After World War I, we became an isolationist country, a country that didn't want to get involved in foreign affairs, that we felt that getting involved in foreign affairs was a waste, that we lost money, lost lives, and gained us nothing. Now, after World War II, we saw what the fruits of that policy was. You got aggressive countries that tore the world apart. Not just countries, but the entire planet gets torn apart. The United States now, because of nuclear weapons, knows we cannot allow that to happen anymore. So the United States commits itself to limiting aggressive behavior wherever it appears. And the United States does more than that. We start trying to shore up friends, trying to find friends in any part of the world to help us do these things, to make sure that we have people on our side, countries that will support us and our policies. Sometimes we even go out and make them where they don't already exist. In 1948, as kind of part of this containment policy, the United States helps create the State of Israel in the Middle East, making sure that European Jews who've been decimated by things like the Holocaust and just the warfare in general in Europe have a safe haven, someplace that they can call their own, where they run their own affairs, kind of a traditional biblical homeland for Judaism. Of course, we don't speak to the people that are already living there and ask them if it's appropriate or if they're okay with this. The Palestinians and Arab neighbors in the area believe this land to be theirs, and they are very resentful when the United States steps in and says that it's going to create a new country with a new group of people living there on areas that they already claimed as their own. So this is going to lead to a lot of turmoil as well. So you can kind of see American policy is directed towards one thing, and sometimes it loses sight of other issues that it's creating in following its policy of containment, of working against communism. But the United States also goes forward and makes formal alliances. So again, something that we weren't willing to do after the First World War, we're now very much willing to do after the Second World War. We enter into a formal military alliance with a number of European countries, including Canada, when we formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to make sure that these European countries know that the United States is there to support them, not just economically, but also militarily. So the United States is very active in this period. And it's a very important that we are doing this, because there are challenges from the very beginning. The Soviet Union, in an attempt to kind of show that they actually have the momentum here, that they're actually the ones that to be reckoned with, that they have a lot of control over their part of Europe, blockade Western Berlin in 1948. They cut off that western city. Now remember, Berlin has been divided up, like much of Germany has been, between the victorious Allied powers. The Russians got the eastern half, the Allies got the western half. That would be France, Britain, and the United States. So the city of Berlin, the capital of Germany, was divided along the same lines as the entire country of Germany was. The Russians had the eastern half, the western half went to France, Great Britain, and the United States. Well, by 1948, the Russians, who really were frightened by what the United States was doing, going around supporting countries, trying to limit its influence, decided that they would return the favor and try to limit American influence, especially there in Western Berlin, where a lot of Germans were escaping to. A lot of Germans didn't like being under Russian control, and they would run to Western Berlin and escape out to Western Germany, the part controlled by the Western Allies. So this was kind of politically embarrassing to the Russians because it kind of seemed like everybody was fleeing from them. So they decided to cut off Berlin completely. They no longer allowed trains or trucks to come in with supplies or allowed people to move in or out of Western Berlin. Well, this is quite a test for the United States. The Truman administration decides that this is one of those moments where it has to show the Russians that we mean business and that we're not going to back down. That if we back down here, the Russians will increase their activities and begin pressing us everywhere across the world. So the United States responds in a very unique way. Working with our British allies, we start flying in everything that a modern city would need to run. From coal to run power plants, to toothpaste, toilet paper, newspapers, it doesn't matter, food, water, it all gets flown in. The Russians had not thought this was logistically possible. For most countries, it isn't. But the United States was so powerful at that time, had so many planes, so much fuel, that it could actually afford to airmail everything in that a city of several 100,000 people needed. So kind of think about it this way. Could a group of people, could a nation supply hundreds of thousands of people by strictly flying in airplanes full of supplies? I mean, think about it. Airlines are the most expensive way to travel. They're the most expensive way to send anything. And here's the United States shipping in everything a city needs to exist on, to live on, to function on. So again, the Russians are taken completely by surprise. They thought the United States would have to evacuate Western Berlin and that it would show that they meant business and that they were just as powerful as the United States. Instead, it ends up being kind of embarrassing when the United States is able to fly for more than a year all these supplies in, essentially telling the Russians that they had no control over this, that the United States was a world power. In response to this kind of embarrassing predicament, the Russians go ahead and set up their own German state in eastern Germany, which they call the German Democratic Republic. So now we see that Europe is being kind of formally split between these two sides, that they're each kind of going their own way, that they're becoming not rivals, but maybe even. And as this map shows, Russia makes sure that it has firm control over Eastern Europe. Countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, that were supposed to be free and independent states, are very much under Russian control. Western Europe looks more and more not necessarily under American control, but certainly dependent on the United States, both for economic and military support. So there is very much a dividing line. Teams are being chosen here, and it quickly spreads not just into Europe, but throughout the world. These two sides, the Russians and the Americans, start finding supporters, allies to work with. And this extension of this race between these two countries for supporters to find allies out in the world makes this a worldwide event. Throughout the 1940s, the United States tries to find friends. We give the Philippines, a country that we ended up taking over from the Spanish Empire in 1898, we give it its independence in 1946. The Filipinos had worked alongside us against the Japanese, fought hard with us, helped our soldiers out all throughout the war, and in return for that loyalty, they were given their independence. But of course, the United States military would still be based there to a large degree in the Philippines. So the United States was looking for friends. This issue became very important for the Truman administration in 1949 when Chinese communists, with a lot of Russian support, were able to take over China. A lot of Americans were very shocked by this. They thought that the United States would be able to support our friends, Chiang Kai-shek, who's shown in this photo here in the corner. This is Chiang Kai-shek, this is Mao Zedong, the communist leader's Mao Zedong. Chiang Kai-shek is what's called the nationalist leader. He was our ally. And when he gets forced out of China, when the communists actually take control of mainland China, and Chiang Kai-shek has to retreat to the island of Taiwan, essentially setting up a separate state there, a separate China, if you will. A lot of people blame the Truman administration for not watching what's going on, for not holding together with this policy of containment, for not stopping this expansion of communism. It looks very scary. And at the same time that China becomes a communist country, the Soviet Union also sets off a nuclear weapon, something that the United States thought they wouldn't be able to do for more than a decade. And here, just a couple years after the United States detonates its own nuclear weapons, now the Russians have it. And a lot of Americans begin to wonder, how could the Russians catch up so quickly? Well, one of the reasons that a lot of Americans felt that the Russians were able to get this technology so fast was that they stole it, that there were spies in the United States working for the Russians. So the world starts to become a very scary place for a lot of Americans. They start looking at this very nervously now, that it looks like coming out of World War II, we may be sliding quickly into World War III. And this will be a war that's going to have nuclear weapons available in it that can destroy whole cities at a time. So the world's getting to be a very, very scary place. In response to these changes, this policy of containment that Kennan laid out in 1947 kind of gets modified. A thing called the National Security Council was created by the Truman administration to help coordinate this effort of containment, to kind of watch this communist threat that's growing out there in the world. And this National Security Council started coming up with some policies, some ideas on how to coordinate this effort of containment. And one of the things it started recommending to the Truman administration was kind of a three-pronged approach. That the United States really needed to beef up its military, that it could not actually demobilize as it does after wars, and as it was doing after World War II. A lot of American soldiers were brought home, sent back into the civilian workforce. Well, the NSC, the National Security Council, said, actually, we've got to reverse that trend. We need to start building more ships, more tanks, get more men into uniform, because they're needed everywhere in the world. The United States military needs to spread out across the globe. At the same time, the NSC said, we need to build up our nuclear weapons. We need to have more of them. The only way we can really tell the Russians to watch out is if we can threaten the Russians everywhere. That anywhere that they have cities or troops, we can threaten them with nuclear weapons, which means we need a lot more of them. And then the third thing the NSC said that was important for the Truman administration to do was to go out and find these communists that were here at home, to look for these communist threats. That's the way communists took over countries, was from within, by destabilizing them. So to carry out its mission, the United States needed to be safe from communism at home, to make the world safe from communism abroad, right? So it's a two-pronged approach. We've got to root out communism at home. And the NSC came up with an idea here, right? To do this, we needed to tell people why communism's so dangerous, what's so bad about it, but at the same time, we needed to find communists and remove them, get them out of wherever they might be in American society. So this is an important thing that the NSC tells the Truman administration that it has to do. And the Truman administration takes this advice very seriously and implements it as best it can. One of the ways that this happens is through a thing called the House Committee on Un-American Activities, kind of one of these congressional hearing panels that's tasked with certain jobs, right? Well, this one's job was changed in the 1940s to start looking for these communist subversives. And one of the places where these politicians felt that they could find evidence of communist infiltration, of communists kind of working their way into American society, was in Hollywood, where they said that there were a lot of filmmakers, a lot of propaganda that came out before the war and during the war that seemed very sympathetic to communism in general, and sometimes very sympathetic to Russia in particular. So they started calling forward a lot of Hollywood icons, big stars like Gary Cooper, Walt Disney, even some not so well-known stars like Ronald Reagan were called forward to testify in front of this congressional hearing panel, and asked what they knew about communism in Hollywood. Most of them didn't know anything, but some said that they suspected others of being communists, and they gave those names to those congressmen. Those congressmen in turn subpoenaed or asked these other people to come forward and speak. Eventually, there were a number of producers and writers that were brought forward to Congress, and 10 of them refused to talk. They just said that we're not answering any questions. Our Fifth Amendment says we don't have to answer these questions if we don't want to, that we have a right to say whatever we want, however we want, to politically believe whatever we want. And Congress very much disagreed with them. They said that this is a national security issue, that we need to know what you want to do, why you're doing the things you're doing. You need to explain yourself. You need to tell us if you know if there's any communist elements there in Hollywood. And when these 10 Hollywood writers and producers refused to acknowledge this, to answer their questions, they were imprisoned without ever being charged with the crime other than contempt for Congress, and never ever being put on trial. To a lot of Americans, it seemed like maybe there's something here, maybe there's something dangerous. And as you can kind of see down in this comic book, from this Captain America comic book that came out, actually started before World War II started, but now is kind of an icon, kind of a mainstream comic book for the period, right? You can see that now Americans are really worried about this communist threat, that they are afraid that communism's spreading out there in the world, that it's a dangerous force and it means bad things for the United States. So Captain America has to go to war with them, just like he had gone to war with the Nazis in World War II. So Americans are really worried about this, right? Politicians are worried about these un-Americans, right? These communist elements kind of working their way into American society. It's starting to this fear is starting to kind of spread out into the general culture and things like comic books. So America is becoming a very, very worried in this period. And Congress, through HUAC, as it's called, this House Committee on Un-American Activities, keeps looking for these communist elements. And eventually they call forward a number of people. And one of these people that is kind of tangentially connected to Hollywood is a guy by the name of Whittaker Chambers, who in 1948 is brought forward to testify before Congress. And when he's brought forward, he readily admits that he had been affiliated somewhat with communists. He had gone to communist meetings back during the Great Depression, and that he actually knew some communists. And under further probing, Whittaker Chambers comes forward and says that he actually knows of current communists that are inside the United States government. And he actually names a name during this while he's testifying. He gives the name of a State Department official by the name of Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss is brought forward, asked to explain himself. He vehemently denies all these things, says that Whittaker Chambers is a liar and that he's never met them. But as the FBI continues to investigate behind the scenes, kind of checking out both sides' stories, it quickly comes out that Whittaker Chambers is telling more of the truth than Alger Hiss is. That Alger Hiss, when confronted with some of the evidence, actually changes his story. Admits that yes, he went to communist meetings, but only because he was dating a girl that was a communist. Starts saying that he didn't mean to go to a lot of these meetings. He just kind of ended up there when he went with friends. But his story looks more and more unreliable. Eventually, he's accused of espionage, and he's going to be put into jail for 44 months as a Soviet spy. Now, of course, years later, after the Soviet Union crumbles, evidence comes out that, in fact, Alger Hiss was a spy. He was a communist spy. He was working for the Russians. So, in hindsight, the FBI and Whittaker Chambers and the Congress actually got it right. But at the time, they weren't absolutely sure of it. To them, it just seemed like it. Seemed like Hiss was a spy, that he was a dangerous element. And when he goes to prison, a lot of Americans start wondering who else could be a spy. If there's one, could there be more? So they look even harder, especially the United States government looks even harder for more evidence of Soviet espionage, of Soviet activity in the United States. Remember, they've got to root this stuff out so we can stay strong, so we can help the rest of the world stay safe from communism. So more and more investigations are launched all throughout the United States. And quickly they start trying to figure out how nuclear technology got into the hands of the Russians. And one of the places where they start looking is in the United States Army labs that helped design some of the systems that went into nuclear weaponry. Now, eventually, as this investigation folds out, spreads out, it ends up touching on just about any portion of military technology there is. And eventually, there are some connections here. There are some delvings into some possible security leaks. And one of those ends up in an Army base outside of New York City in New Jersey, where a guy by the name of David Greenglass is apprehended by the FBI. And he's seen as a possible courier, a guy that transfers information for Russian agents. When Greenglass is arrested, he at first is reluctant to speak to the FBI and give them any information. Eventually, when the FBI threatens that they'll bring in his wife as well and put her in jail, leaving their kids out on their own with no one to help them, Greenglass caves in. He gives the FBI all the information they want, essentially telling them everything that he knows. And one of the things he says he does is helps his brother-in-law, a guy by the name of Julius Rosenberg, sell information to the Russians. The FBI continues their investigation. They go to Julius Rosenberg, who was an Army engineer during World War II. He happened to work on a lot of the weapons systems that were important for World War II, none of them for the nuclear weapon programs, but stuff that still ended up in the Russian military. They go and investigate Julius Rosenberg. They question him. He refuses to talk. In an effort to try and get Julius to talk and tell them everything that they know, they once again apply pressure to his wife, like they had done with David Greenglass, who happens to be Julius's brother-in-law. So Ethel, David Greenglass's sister, Julius Rosenberg's wife, is brought into the mix. The FBI puts pressure on her to tell what she knows about her husband's goings-ons. What if he is a Russian spy, if he's given Russian information? She refuses to talk, just like her husband. So the FBI has to keep ratcheting up the pressure, trying to get these two to give up their information, to kind of turn over everything they know about Soviet spy networks in the United States. Both refuse, claiming to be innocent the entire way. Slowly but surely, though, the FBI feels that it is gaining some evidence, that it's not just David Greenglass, but they actually have other witnesses that say that these two do know some possible Soviet spies, that they have given some of this information away to the Russians. They slowly put a case together, it goes to trial, and really in some very spectacular courtroom drama, they're eventually found guilty. They're sentenced under the Alien Sedition Acts from World War I with aiding the enemy, and they're sentenced to die. Now, the interesting thing here is we're actually not at war with anyone, so treason doesn't really apply in this case. But because the Russians are seen as so dangerous, because we see them as the ones that are causing so much trouble out there, they're given the death sentence. Both of them, the husband and wife. A lot of people across the world are shocked. They think the United States seems to be really overreacting here, that there really isn't a lot of evidence to put away the Rosenbergs in prison, let alone kill them for it. Many Americans feel that the Rosenbergs are getting exactly what they deserve because they're not cooperating. If they had nothing to hide, they should just cooperate with the federal government and tell them everything that they know. The Rosenbergs claim that they don't have to do any of this. Freedom of speech, freedom of the Fifth Amendment says that they don't have to say anything if they don't want to. The United States government obviously disagreed with them. Eventually, this case gets appealed all the way up through the court systems. Their death sentence is once again challenged on several levels of appellate juries, and once again is found to be the correct decision, that nobody will rescind the death order, that they are going to be executed. And finally, in 1953, both Julius and his wife Ethel are executed. Many people across the world think that this has been a miscarriage of justice. Some Americans feel that it was justice. It splits a lot of people, drives some deep wounds in some of our allies, especially the French and some people in Britain who thought the United States was being overzealous. Of course, years later, like in the case of Alger Hiss, new information's found, and of course, the Rosenbergs are found to be spies. Maybe not Ethel, but Julius actually had a code name and was a source for Soviet espionage. So once again, the United States got it right, even if they didn't quite know exactly why they were getting it right. But for a lot of people, this proved, the Alger Hiss case, the Rosenberg case, proved that there were Russians here in the United States trying to tear us down from within. These dangerous subversives were working to tear apart the United States. And this is incredibly important during this period of fear and just real kind of apprehension in the world that could end up in a new Third World War. It really opens up a door of opportunity for people like Joseph McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin, who kind of used this fear of communism to really kind of further his own political career, to really kind of make a name for himself. In a very famous speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, of all places, so a little tiny town in West Virginia that nobody really had spent a lot of time studying or had very few direct connections to the United States or international diplomacy. He gives a speech there in 1950 where he claims to know that there are several hundred people working for the federal government. When pressed for their names, he tells people to come to his next speech to listen to him talk again, and he'll give those names then. He keeps giving these speeches, never giving these names, but keeps claiming that he knows that there's Soviet spies in the United States, that they're Americans who are secret communists supporting the Soviet Union. And he makes a name for himself. He becomes an instant celebrity. He gets to take command of kind of the Senate version of HUAC, right? This House committee. There's a Senate committee as well doing essentially the same thing. He gets to make a name for himself. He gets to bring people in front of the cameras in Congress and question them and grill them, and he does. He drags them through the mud, asks them really hard questions, sometimes unfair questions, sometimes accusing them of things that they have no connection to, because it gives him attention. It gives him a chance to make a name for himself. This goes on for several years until he finally starts accusing loyal members of the United States military, who obviously no way, shape, or form could be connected to communism, that have lots of people vouching for them. That's when he goes too far, is when he really kind of loses his credibility. But up until this point, nobody really kind of stood up to him. They just kind of allowed him to kind of do what he wanted. For Republicans, because he was a Republican, it was kind of good because it kind of damaged the Democratic Party. A lot of the people that McCarthy would talk to and accuse of being dangerous communist sympathizers happen to be Democrats or lean towards Democrats. So this is a way for a lot of Republicans to kind of limit Democratic power, to kind of make Republicans a viable party again. Remember, they've been out of power since the 1932 election, so they're looking for a chance to get back into the political game, so to speak. So for about 3 or 4 years, the United States is really kind of swept with kind of a hysteria, what's called the McCarthyism, right? This fear that there are Soviets amongst us and that we have to root them out. So things are kind of becoming very reactionary in the United States during this period. There is a lot of fear, and if you step out, if you're somebody that's different, if you're somebody that's challenging authority, criticizing the United States, you really start looking like maybe you're on the wrong side. You get questioned for this. So even being a loyal dissident, right, being somebody that can kind of question American policy and still be a loyal American, that's kind of thrown out the window. You can't do that anymore. You either have to be on board or off board. You have to either conform to policy, or you're somebody that's dangerous and is possibly on the wrong side. This becomes even more pronounced when the Cold War actually becomes a shooting war. It's no longer just a rivalry. It's no longer just two countries kind of positioning themselves in the world, trying to find friends in the world and gain influence over countries. We actually start shooting at each other. This happens in a place called Korea in 1950. The Korean Peninsula was actually divided up. It was occupied by Japan during World War II, and after the war, Russian troops took the northern half of the peninsula. American troops took the southern half of the peninsula. Now, the idea was, just like in Germany, that both sides would eventually remove themselves and allow the Koreans to decide for themselves what kind of government they were going to have. But of course, in this post-war tension, neither of these countries followed through. The United States keeps a few troops in southern Korea, pulls out most of its troops to actually go and occupy Japan and help rebuild Japan. But the Russians keep their troops in northern Korea, help militarize northern Korea, deciding that possibly, if given the chance, they'd allow the northern Koreans to go ahead and unify the entire peninsula under communist rule. This is exactly what happens in the summer of 1950. After building up their military forces, the North Koreans feel that they have enough strength that they can unify the peninsula, drive any remaining American troops and the southern Koreans that they've helped build up as their kind of allies in the region, and they decide to attack. Very quickly, it seems like the North Koreans are going to win this war. They strike suddenly without any kind of warning and start taking over large chunks of South Korea. The United States, once again, is kind of caught flat-footed. The Truman administration, just like in the case of China, looks like it's not paying attention, that it's dropped the ball, so to speak. But quickly, the Truman administration decides that they have to meet this aggression, quickly and decisively. Truman sends ambassadors to the UN to tell the world that naked aggression like this has to be stopped. This is what got us into trouble in World War II, by not standing up to countries like North Korea that just attacked their neighbors. And he gets the United Nations to okay military intervention, led by the United States. So the United States, with its allies from Western Europe and other countries, floods into North Korea. The United States government gives command of this operation to a war hero from World War II, General Douglas MacArthur, who launches a surprise amphibious campaign that lands just north of Seoul, the main city in South Korea, and surprises the North Koreans. Lands way behind their troops, threatening their supply lines. As American troops pour into North Korea, the North Koreans have to start running back to defend their portion of the Korean peninsula. Suddenly their attack starts collapsing. But as U.S. troops advance, starting to conquer the entire Korean peninsula, the new communist country of China warns the United States not to advance too far, that it's getting too close to its borders. And even in the face of this kind of warning from China, MacArthur says now's the time to wipe out these communist countries. Now's the time that we've got the men and we've got the material and we have nuclear weapons, we should use them. And he starts saying that maybe the United States should invade China and get rid of those communists like we're getting rid of the communists in North Korea. Of course, this scares the Chinese, and eventually as American troops get close to the Chinese border, they unleash several 100,000 Chinese troops. The United States and China are at war. For a lot of Americans, it seems like just the next step before we're at war with the Russians. Truman relieves MacArthur of command because Truman had gone too far. He'd done things without consulting Truman himself. So he removes MacArthur from command, trying to say that the United States policy, foreign policy, is not run by generals, but it's run by the President of the United States. That no nuclear weapons are going to be used without the express permission of the President of the United States. But once again, until the American people, it seems like the Truman administration's not really in control of things, that they really don't have a handle on what they're doing, that it seems kind of inept. And as a result, when elections come up in 1952, Truman refuses to run. The Democrats nominate Adlai Stevenson, but he is crushed in an election against a very popular war hero, Dwight David Eisenhower, the man that ran the European Theater of Operations for the United States, was actually the head general for all Allied armies in the Western theaters, and he wins handily in the 1952 election. What kind of comes out of this is Americans are really kind of tired of Korea. We just got out of World War II, and now it looks like we're going to be in a never-ending war against communism. Americans don't want to deal with that. They think that the Democrats and the Truman administration especially don't seem to have a lot of answers. So for the first time in 20 years, they give Republicans a shot in the government again. Some important things to kind of think about here. The end of World War II ends this great alliance that was created in the world to defeat these dangerous, aggressive nations, Germany and Japan. But as soon as that threat is gone, this coalition breaks down. And it essentially breaks down into two spheres, the Russians on one side, the Americans on the other. But the American government does something interesting here. It doesn't shrink from this opportunity. It doesn't shrink from this responsibility. The United States does take its place as a world leader, something it wouldn't do after World War I. It's determined to keep the peace. It understands that aggressive nations are dangerous, that they cause too many problems, and now with nuclear weapons, can just get too dangerous out there to let things just kind of alone, to let countries do whatever they want. We want to make the Russians live up to their promises. That becomes impossible. So the only answer the United States government thinks it has left is containment, making sure that this dangerous country, this communist system, doesn't spread any further. And to make sure that that happens, it means we have to look for these subversive elements, these communist infiltrators that'll try and tear you down from within. So Americans look for their security both internally and externally. And to do this, they want strong leaders that can carry out this policy, not people like Truman, who seem to be kind of inept, right? Now, in the long run, looking back at it, historians have come to see the Truman administration as being a very efficient administration, that it gets a lot of things done. But Americans at the time are so frightened that any missteps, any kind of missed opportunities look bad, right? You can't lose any battles against communism. You have to win them all. So they look for leaders that look like they can pull those kind of things off. And the one that they choose immediately is Dwight Eisenhower. And we'll pick up that story in the next section. Thank you.